Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As we continue our series of webinars to discuss the impact on this pandemic in Brazil, we are going to talk today about the impact of COVID-19 on labor and employment in Brazil. On the discussion panel today, we have partners Amadeu Ribeiro, who manages the New York office, and partner Rodrigo Ferreira Figueiredo, manager at the London office. They're going to be the moderators on today's call. And answering questions, we have partner Ana Cândida Samarco and partner Vilma Kutomi. We would like to recommend that you download the Zoom app to your desktop or your mobile to make it easier to ask questions. You can send your questions through the chat box, and the speakers will do their best to answer as many questions as they can during the call. But you should also know that the speakers will reach out by email to answer any questions that couldn't be answered live. So we do encourage you to send your questions. We hope you enjoyed the call today, and now I turn over the word to partner Amadeu Ribeiro.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. It is a pleasure to join this webinar and to be moderating it with my partner Rodrigo Figueiredo and to have my partners Vilma Kutomi and Ana Samarco. We are here to talk about the impact on labor and employment in Brazil, and yet we will start discussing health and regulations and how changes in the health sector have affected labor and employment. And for that, we'll have our partner from our health and life sciences practice, Ana Samarco, who will start by giving us a brief overview of key legal developments in the health area and talk about their businesses in general. So Ana, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amadeo. Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and speak a little bit about what we currently have on legal framework, not only for the COVID-19 pandemic, but also for the life science and healthcare industry in general. So just to put everybody on the same page, I think it's important to give you a brief overview of how the healthcare system is provided here in Brazil. So our federal constitution granted to have to all Brazilian citizens the right to health, and that's the reason why the federal government not only carry public health assistance activities, but also establish social and economic policies and regulation regarding to health protection and the provision of medical service in Brazil. Because of the right to health is a constitutional right, the federal government created the Universal Health Systems, which we call SUS, is one of the largest health systems in the world and comprises a series of actions and healthcare service provided by agents, the federal government, state and local public institutions. And it ranges from a simple outpatient care to a organ transplantation, and it's ensure a full, universal, and free access to the entire Brazilian population. And in parallel to SUS, to our universal health system, we also have private companies doing business in the healthcare sector, not only as healthcare providers, but also as healthcare plan operators and also healthcare insurance company. So we have both public and private entities acting together in the healthcare industry here in Brazil. Specific in regard to the coronavirus, the federal government has declared the state of calamity and also the public health emergency in Brazil. and these enable certain measures to be taken by the government to prevent, control, and contain the risks and damages during this pandemic, during this outbreak. And some of these measures has very, very important impacts in business in general. There is a bunch of new regulations granting the right to the federal government and also to the state and local authorities to impose periods of isolation and quarantine, the compulsory performance of medical examinations, restrictions on immigrations, and some other very restricted measures. So more than that, the federal government and local authorities also issued a list of activities that are deemed as essentials, and these activities may continue to be open and perform business, but also must comply with all the health recommendations and the determinations issued by the authorities in order to continue to perform these activities. And we also have additional state and local regulations establishing more restricted measures than the federal ones, and this is the case of São Paulo. So we may have different scenarios depend on the specific place where the business is located.
Thank you, Ana. One of the questions that we've been receiving more frequently from clients is as they are running their businesses and they identify cases of employees that are diagnosed with COVID-19, how should they proceed? Are they required to notify authorities in that respect?
Yes, that's a good question. The coronavirus is a disease that requires a mandatory report to health authorities. In general, it must be submitted by the health professions that are taking care of the patients or the healthcare facility where the patient is located. But the specific regulation about coronavirus also established that every person must collaborate with the health authorities and must report in case of suspected or infection of coronavirus. So in this sense, a company, if a company knows that an employee is infected with coronavirus, the best way to move forward is to make sure that the physician that is taking care of this employee notified the health authorities or the patient, his or herself, did it. Otherwise, the company must look for the health authorities and notify the authorities about the infection and provided all the required data to support the public authorities on the best way to at least reduce the impacts of this contamination.
Thank you. Now let's switch to the topic of the health industry and medical devices and everyone who's supplying equipment to cope with the crisis. We see the shortage of supplies everywhere, and Brazil is no exception. And the government, in response to that, is developing, I understand, some relaxation in the regulatory requirements for health-related products. Is this really happening, and how is it affecting business of health and life sciences companies in Brazil specifically?
Yeah, in fact, as a general rule, in order to do business in the life science area here in Brazil, a company must have a specific license, mailing license issued by our Brazilian health sanitary agents called Anvisa, and also from the Brazilian Ministry of Health. And the products themselves also must be registered before the authority. So a product can only be in the Brazilian market after receiving a marketing authorization from Anvisa. So this is the general rule. This is a very bureaucratic and time-consuming process. And now, because of the pandemic, the authorities issued some exceptions, some waivers to allow companies to manufacture products and also to allow the import of products and goods required for the fight of COVID-19. And some of the waivers are related to license and authorizations to manufacture products for the purpose of donation to the Brazilian health public health system, to SUS. We also have waivers for companies that does not usually manufacture these kind of products, but already do business in the life science space. So these kind of companies, like companies that manufacture cosmetics and medicines, can start also to manufacture hand sanitizers and masks and things like that. And also waivers for companies that would like to import or distribute or even manufacture products related to the individual protection of the healthcare professionals. Uh, in general, what we are realizing is that all the waivers required for the donation for the public system is in fact being accepted. However, we are still facing a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of requirements when we talk about private companies trying to import and bring to Brazil this type of products related to the coronavirus. So as we have a specific regulation that waiver all of these license and register and registrations. However, we are still facing some bureaucracy, specifically in the import process of this kind of products to Brazil.
Thank you. This nevertheless seems to be a positive development. Another area where we see a positive development is in telemedicine. We see new regulations that were debated for quite some time in Brazil finally enacted to help people get the medical support that they need during the crisis. How is that happening? Is this really creating a new market in Brazil? Is it a new industry that is here to stay after the crisis is over?
Yeah, we hope so. We were waiting for the telemedicine regulation for a long time. In fact, we had a very restricted regulation issued by the Brazilian Federal Council of Medicine that allowed the telemedicine only in very specific circumstances. But due to the pandemic, first the Ministry of Health, and yesterday we had a law that allowed and regulated the telemedicine as a measure to confront the pandemic. So during this period of time, during the period of the pandemic, the telemedicine is permitted here in Brazil, not only to treat the coronavirus, but to treat all the diseases. But it's still subject to further regulation after the pandemic and after this specific crisis. But you know, the digital area is here, and everybody is receiving the benefits of the telemedicine. So we really hope that after that, our Congress and also the Brazilian Federal Council of Medicines pay more attention to this matter, and then we can have a specific regulation and to allow the telemedicine to continue after that. But currently, the permission is only for this specific period of time of the pandemic.
Thank you, Ana. With this introduction on what's happening on the life sciences and healthcare front, I will turn it over to my partner, Rodrigo Figueiredo. He will cover with my partner, Vilma Kutomi, labor and employment. Thank you.
Thank you, Amadeu. Vilma, I think it is fair to say that Brazil does not rank in the top 10 jurisdictions in terms of flexibility of labor regulations. The country is historically perceived as very protective of the rights of employees and somewhat inflexible, although in recent years we have had important reforms to change that a little bit. But now we are clearly in a situation that appears to demand quite a lot of flexibility, and we have seen the government acting in terms of enacting new regulations. I believe one of the objectives would be to help businesses maintain jobs and to protect the economy. Can you give us an overview of the key legal developments in the labor and employment area as a result of COVID-19?
Thank you, Rodrigo. Hello to all who are participating in this webinar. Yes, you are right. Brazil still faces inflexible decisions regarding the last labor reform that was enacted in 2017. And now we are facing this state of exception as a result of this public calamity and due to this national emergency regarding the health. And what is the impact of it towards the employees' relations? The fact is that in the last months, because of this social isolation restriction, some companies are facing some issues regarding his normal or regular activities. For example, hotels, they had to close immediately their business because there was no clients. Some companies from events or promotions, they had to cancel. And then if we look to what happened in Brazil is that all companies, services, in traditional industry, of course, except to essential services, they were all impacted. And the result of that is the government, in order to respond to that emergency, because we started having a collective dismissals, the government enacted 2 provisional measures. These 2 provisional measures are to be put in place on a temporary basis. For example, one of them is related to reduction of salary and working hours and suspension of employment. And the maximum period is 90 days. The other provisional measures is related to the relaxation of labor and employment provisions in order to allow the employer to put employees on collective vacations, individual vacations, regardless of what is the current labor law provision. So making all these provisions more flexible, that was the response of the government in order to try to preserve the employment. And when we talk about these provisional measures, is this a legal certainty that any employer could enforce it? Well, primarily our answer would be yes, the employer could, and employers are doing it. They are taking measures. But does it mean that the employers could be tranquil in terms of applying it. As Rodrigo mentioned, unfortunately, we have seen some litigation that was put in place with the Supreme Court. And for this reason, for employers who are enforcing these measures, what we have recommended is, first of all, there is an urgent need to preserve the employment. And if it is the employer's intention to keep them, then of course we have a provisional measure that is a law. While this provisional measure is in force, and employers may take the advantage of using it, regardless of all of them being challenged with the courts. And talking about a little bit of this relaxation of labor and employment provisions, we have what we have in terms of flexibility. The use of home office. Employers may use the home office by executing an agreement with the employee. And why is that? Because there are some companies that still they have activities, but due to the social isolation, the work must be done at work, at home, sorry. And for this reason, the possibility of having this home office makes more flexible the preservation of employment. Regarding vacation, we have some term days in order to provide vacation period to the employees. Under this provisional measure, there is no need to comply with these deadlines. And regarding the bank of hours, that is, the employers may compensate the overtime hours with the days off or rest hours within 18 months. So this is a possibility of not paying overtime, but instead offsetting these overtime hours. And in addition to this, the government provided the facility to the employer not to pay the severance fund now, but to postpone the payment. So for these 3 months, March, April, May, the employers may pay the severance fund in 6 installments as of July. So which means that any companies that is facing a serious economic situation could postpone those payments. Holidays, the current law does not allow the employee to choose or to work in a different day, but the provisional measure allows it. And finally, the COVID-19 is not considered a work-related illness, although it could be considered if there is a causal link between the working conditions and activities. So this is one provisional measure. The other one that is related to the reduction of salary and working hours, the government decided that there would be a need to put in place immediately. And for this purpose, there shouldn't be any negotiation with the unions. And this is the reason for why we are having a litigation now at the Supreme Court. The judgment will be today about it, whether the suspension of employment and the reduction of salary should or not be subject to the union negotiation. And in terms of applying the suspension of work, the government decided to implement in terms of percentage, 25%, 50%, and 70%. And in regard of the suspension of employment, a mandatory payment from the employer side regarding the payment of 30% of the salary, and the government will pay an additional benefit to the employees. So in terms of provisional measures, these are the urgent measures that the employer may use.
Thank you, Vilma. These seem to be indeed welcome measures by the Brazilian government. There seems to be some uncertainty and lawsuits being filed with the Supreme Court, which hopefully will be overcome soon. Now, elsewhere in the world, we have seen similar measures, and in some places we see they haven't fully achieved their objective in terms of fully protecting jobs. So, for instance, here in the UK, you see companies which has taken similar measures. You see some companies saying, you know, they won't, they will help, but not necessarily will lead companies to being able to keep all the workforce in place. So some terminations may be inevitable. We read in the US, Amadeu may know more about it, but many millions of people have been laid off in a very short period of time, leading to record unemployment levels. So in the case of Brazil, regardless of governmental actions, these measures, these relaxation measures you've just talked about, are employees being terminated? Have you seen terminations taking place? What's your view on that?
Yes, because some companies cannot put in place any of these measures simply because of a financial or economic situation. And in this case, all these employers, they are terminating the employment and even not paying the mandatory severance, which means that we have seen some labor claims from the union side in order to make all this termination null and void with the reinstatement of all these terminated employees to work.
I see. So that seems to be very important. In terms of how labor authorities and labor unions have reacted relating to employees that continue operating essential services and that receive permission by the state government to continue operating, how have these authorities and labor unions behave in relation to that?
Yeah, what is requested to these employers is to comply with the health measures. That is, in order to prevent the contagions of the new coronavirus, the employer must provide to the employees all the health equipment and the health measures regarding the prevention of the COVID-19 disease.
And specifically with regard to measures, sort of protective measures, such as collecting temperatures of employees that are going to work, what are the employer's limits to take the healthcare measures with employees?
Yeah, this issue shall be analyzed based on the regulatory norms as well as labor. And from the health perspective, that is to keep people healthy. So in this case, any disobedience from any citizen or any worker could be subject of sanctions. And within the labor environment would not be different, because the most important thing is to preserve the health and as a consequence, the life. And based on this, we have some labor provisions in which the employee cannot refuse to comply with these measures, which means that the employer, in this case, not the employer itself, but the occupational physician, has the right to request and to demand the employees to comply with these regulatory health norms as well as labor.
That's important to know. Back to the point I was making when we started this fireside chat. Brazilian labor and employment regulations have been historically somewhat inflexible. That has changed a little bit in the recent reforms, labor reforms we had. And now, as a result of this situation, we have a number of relaxation measures you just talked about. Would you expect that once this crisis is over, some of these measures, perhaps not to the same extent, but maybe used in in further reforming labor laws in Brazil? You think that as a result of this, the government may think that the country can benefit from a more relaxed labor regulation and act to make our laws more friendly to businesses?
Yeah, I think that this will depend on the post pandemic situation. But what we believe is that we will have a more unemployment. And why? Because after the crisis, usually the companies, they tend not to have an immediate economic situation that could allow them to keep all employees. Our experience dealing with this kind of situation, economic and other economic crises that we had to face in the past, allows us to say that usually we have to take the immediate measure in order to preserve the employment. But after that, after the emergency is gone, usually we will still face the impact of it, either by changing the employees' compensation, benefits, or even labor rights, as well as to face some termination. So this is what we expect. We do not see much, or we do not envision that there will be an increase of employment immediately. I think that for the next few months, we will see some unemployment, but then after maybe 6, 7, 8 months, maybe the market could start going on a normal or regular basis, but not immediately after that.
Right, and I cannot avoid the question, Vilma. Another area where subsidiaries of foreign groups in Brazil have been dealing with for decades are the amount of labor claims they face. Right, in Brazil, there has been somewhat of an industry of labor claims, employees being fired and then being sought after by lawyers willing to offer, filing labor claims against companies. This has been reduced as a result of labor reforms I mentioned in the past, but now we have this sort of somewhat disruptive situation. Do you think, would you expect the number of labor claims against companies to increase as a result of this pandemic, or would you say, as you say, once this is gone, we'll go back to the situation we found ourselves just before it started, where we were seeing a reduction in the number of labor claims as a result of recent labor reforms?
Yeah, my answer would be not so much if both provisional measures that will be judged by the Supreme Court today are considered constitutional. However, if Supreme Court decides that it is not constitutional, then we might have a significant number of labor claims within these months. On the other hand, if the Supreme Court decides that it is constitutional, then we may face some labor claims, but related mainly to termination of employment.
That's very clear, Vilma. Thank you very much. At this point, I switch over back to Amadeu so that we can start our Q&A session. Over to you, Amadeu.
Thank you, Rodrigo. First of all, I'd like to remind everyone that you can ask questions for our chat box. I'll be taking questions, and I'll start with a few questions to Ana, going back to the life sciences area. Ana, To start, can you tell us a little bit about the prospects and what you see as lying ahead in life sciences and healthcare in Brazil after this crisis? For example, we see talks about further consolidation in a number of sectors. Will that affect life sciences and healthcare in Brazil? Just tell us what your ideas are for the future after the crisis.
I really think that this is a sector that it was already facing a lot of consolidation and integration of companies, and I think it will continue. Now we are realize how important the health sector is for the country, I really believe that this will be a market not only for consolidation, but also for other types of transactions. A lot of hospitals will need to receive investment to continue with the operations, and also HMOs and health insurance companies will need investment and cash to support the operations and the regulatory obligations faced the regulatory agency in regard to assets and all the requirements to support the continuous of the business. So for sure, this will still be a very attractive sector for investments in Brazil.
Thank you. And how about vaccines and treatments that are being tested everywhere as they get accepted as by scientists and people working on them? And how would the process of implementation of those new vaccines and treatments be in Brazil? For example, will there be any foreseeable relaxation in the applicable trials that we typically have? How long do you think this would all take?
Yeah, usually this type of process is very bureaucratic and time consuming. So a process to launch a new product or a new vaccine in Brazil can take more than 2 years if you need to start from scratch, from the establishment of the company in Brazil, and then receiving all the authorizations for the company, and after that the authorization for the vaccine, for the product itself. But for sure we don't have this time. So we are faced an exception, a period of exception. And the government is already relaxing some of the requirements. And I'm pretty sure that if we have a new product or a new vaccine, the process will be a fast track process, and we will need to have a license, we will need to have a market authorization for the product. So the authorities must make sure that the vaccine has the quality and the safety that we need. But for sure, this would be in a fast track process.
Thank you. Thanks. Now, one other question that we've been getting a lot is it relates to sales, to public procurement and sales to the government in general. And we get this question because the government is acting to facilitate the purchase of the public procurement of materials, supplies, and everything it needs to cope with the crisis. Is that affecting your area in particular? And if so, how?
Yeah, it's affecting a lot, especially when we talk about all type of goods related to the fight of COVID-19. So since we are in the state of calamity, this was declared by the federal government and also by state and local authorities as well. So because of that, the federal government can waive bidding process and waive bidding requirements to facilitate all the process to import or also to buy here in Brazil this type of products. So all the life science industry in Brazil is trying to do their best, not only to provide the goods and to support the government with donations and also trying to adapt the business units and the industry to perform different activities and to provide specific equipment and goods for the fight of the coronavirus. So we are having some waivers and some exceptions in the bidding process as well. And the government is using these waivers to facilitate the procurement.
Thank you, Anna. I wanted to go back to Vilma and ask her a few questions. So Vilma, first of all, I think Anna answered this one from a healthcare perspective, but let's talk about it from the standpoint of labor and employment laws in Brazil. What does the employer have to do if one employee is found suspicious of COVID-19?
Yeah, the employer must take this employee to the occupational physician. As in Brazil, any employer has an occupational physician engaged either as an employee or as a contractor. So it is the employer's obligation to prevent the contagions of the disease. And for this reason, the immediate measure is to take the employee to be examined by the occupational physician.
Okay, thanks. And since we're all working from home, how does it work in terms of controlling the hours of employees? Should employers be doing that? If they do it in the office, should they be doing it as regards home office?
Yeah, well, if the employee works under the control of working hours, but due to this home office, the employee will not be subject to have the controlling of hours, then for that period of time in which the employee will work under the home office structure, the employee is not entitled to overtime. But for this purpose, there is a need first to have an agreement, a written agreement with the employee, and second, not to control the working hours.
Thank you. Maybe one other question for you, Vilma. How about we all know about the critical importance of collective bargaining agreements in Brazil with respect to the relationship between employees and employers. How does it work if you need to renegotiate an existing collective bargaining agreement with labor unions? Does it really work under the current circumstances, and how do you do it?
Yes, depends on how much the union is willing to change or to negotiate the current collective agreement. Depends on the conditions, the terms and conditions. But I would say that the first thing that unions will be concerned about is the provisional stability of employment. So this is something that will be put in place by the unions for sure, because any intention of changing the current collective agreement would make sense to the unions if there is in exchange the guarantee of job or of the employment.
Thank you. As we near the end of our session today, I just wanted to offer both you, Vilma, and Anna the opportunity to make any final remarks, talk about things that we maybe haven't covered today. Why don't we start with you, Vilma?
Yeah, well, in terms of employment impact, we never saw a huge crisis in which many sectors could be impacted by a crisis. Usually, we have a domestic economic crisis or a crisis that is a result of international economic situation, capital markets, but based on a pandemic situation, this is the very first time within this 100 years. And this is something new even for the labor relations. This is new even for the unions. I strongly believe that once this crisis is gone, of course, we will still face the impact of it, but at the same time, the mindset culture on how to deal with some labor conditions will change for sure. And this is something that we do not still know what is going to be the extent of this changing of mindset culture. But this is something that we are sure that will happen.
Yeah, so one of the things that I find is, and I think a lot of people are thinking, there will be no going back to normal. So in some ways, this will impact our day-to-day work, and it may be that we will no longer be going to the office every day as we used to, or routinely as we used to. Do you think that labor legislation will quickly adapt in Brazil and to face this new normal that we'll have?
Yes, I believe so. Even, for example, if we consider the Brazilian legal system in terms of how to deal with the labor claims, currently we are facing some issues with some labor courts in which they want to implement the virtual hearings, the virtual judgment session. And this is something that will happen for sure for this near future. But this is something that will change not only the employee relations parties, but as well as the labor courts. And we believe that by saying this, maybe we may have some flexibilities from the labor court judges in order to analyze a labor claim. I think that this may have some positive impact of changing the mind that to be too protective is not a guarantee of employment. On the other hand, guarantee of employment and not being protective would not be a way to deal with the labor relations. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see what's going to be the balance of it.
Okay. Thank you, Vilma.
Yeah.
Anna, let me turn over to you and offer you the opportunity to make your final remarks and talk a little bit about the prospects after the crisis. What do you see?
Yeah, we are definitely facing one of the most important challenges for the life science and the healthcare industry in Brazil. So it's a challenge to provide the adequate service, not only in the private sector, but most importantly in the public sector. Yeah, for the ones that need to count on SUS. So I hope that the government can be a little bit more careful when investing in health, putting more efforts on that, and also granting more opportunities for private companies to support the public health systems. In regard to regulation, I think we are still in the initial phase of the pandemic. So we expect to have more restricted measures to be adopted by government in the different levels. So we are expecting that some state or some local authorities could take more restricted measures than the ones that we are currently having. And for sure, we know that the digital area is here, the digital area affect the healthcare sector in general. This is already a reality, and we cannot be blind for that. So the regulation will have to be adapted. So we really hope that the telemedicine can continue. We really hope that the authorities could support the development of new products, the develop of new health-related products in general, and have less requirements and be less bureaucratic in all the approval process. So we hope that we learn from this lesson, and if by any chance we need to suffer something similar to that in the near future, we'll be more prepared, having a industry here in Brazil capable to support us in terms of all the goods requirements for the fight of a pandemic similar to the one that we are facing today.
Thank you, Ana. Thank you so much. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for joining, and especially our guests for joining us today. With that, we conclude our webinar. There will be, as things develop, there will be new topics and certainly new webinars. So if you'd like to stay updated on developments in Brazil, you have here, on this last slide, there's a link to our news portal. There you can get information that's current on legal developments in the area, and also information about our future events. So thank you very much for joining, and have a great day.